Welcome to the podcast of the University of the West Indies P.J. Patterson Institute for Africa Caribbean Advocacy. The name of our series is Africa Caribbean Reasonings. The purpose or mission of the Institute is to strengthen the relations between Africa and the Caribbean and the wider diaspora. The objective is to highlight for as broad an audience as possible the ties, the connections between Africa, the Caribbean, and the broader diaspora, to underline, emphasize the cultural ties, the historical ties that bind us as people who share a common history and ethnic background. Today we are delighted to have in our presence Professor Michael Taylor of the Faculty of Science and Technology. Welcome, Professor Taylor.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'd like to share a brief portion of Professor Taylor's very expansive bio data. Dr. Michael Taylor is Professor of Climate Science and Dean of the Faculty of Science and Technology at the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies. He is the co-director of the Climate Studies Group, Mona, a research body which explores climate variability and change for the Caribbean region. He is very well published and cited for his scientific work on the impact of climate change on the small islands of the Caribbean region. He's a coordinating lead author on the special report on 1.5 degrees of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He's a Silver Musgrave Awardee for Science. In 2013, he received this award, and the 2019 ANSA Caribbean Laureate for Excellence in Science. In 2021, he was named amongst Apolitical's 100 most influential academics in government globally. Most recently, Professor Taylor authored a chapter in Greta Thunberg's The Climate Book. Professor Taylor was recently appointed as a TWAS Fellow, effective January 1, 2024. Welcome again, Professor Taylor, to our podcast. I know that your biodata is just so broad that we can't spend enough time talking about that. What I would like to address with you now is how you manage to balance administrative work and the academic roles that you have to fulfill as Dean of the faculty.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm certainly glad that you will not go into any of the biographical details. I do not know that I really balance it at all, but I do try.
Yes.
I think one of the things that has definitely helped me is that as one of the things you noted in that introduction is that I co-direct what is called the Climate Studies Group, Mona. Okay. Now, the Climate Studies Group, Mona, is a research group that was really started by one of the forefathers of climate research in the Caribbean, Professor Anthony Chen. In fact, when I was a graduate student, he began this group, and then I have subsequently come on to take over the co-directorship. That group, having a research group and a strong research group, which is co-directed by Professor Tanisha Stevenson. There are several other lecturers within the science faculty and other faculties, graduate students, etc. The strength of that research group is what enables me to continue doing research even as I am doing the administrative. And one of the things I have been very disciplined about, I think, is ensuring that we have our group meetings, that we go to come together, we discuss where the trends are with respect to research, we discuss each other's research, that we keep publishing, because our intent is to always ensure the Caribbean has climate science that is relevant, very contextual. So I think the presence of that group
Yes.
and the ability to have that network of researchers is what has allowed me to somewhat balance.
Would you say that your research also allows you to pay some attention, give some attention to what is happening with climate change in Africa?
Yes, so there are certain what I would call parallels or similarities, especially in the developing kind of country context. And so some of the very issues that we have to deal with, though our focus is on the small island, but because climate is such a development issue, you know, are some of the very same issues that are being dealt with by our colleagues in Africa. And so, we keep tabs on what's happening there. And similarly, we learn from them. And I think, the mutual exchange is also pretty important. Yes, there are synergies.
So, what are some of the specific ways in which climate change affects the Caribbean region and Africa?
So let's talk about the manifestations of climate change
Right.
before we even go into how it impacts things. Certainly, a large part of Africa also falls within this kind of tropical belt. Not everywhere, but fall within this tropical belt. And so we tend to have some of the similar manifestations. One is, of course, the warming temperatures.
Yes.
And very often people will say, but you're tropical, you're used to warm temperatures. But we have seen distinct changes in the temperature regimes, certainly within the Caribbean and also in Africa. So we have seen the global warming trends, how they manifest. It's not just very, very warm days, but it's also very, very warm nights. It's also greater proportion of the year being really extremely hot. And so that is a common trend. Variability in rainfall is another common trend. So when we talk about variability in rainfall, we used to be able to define what we call the rainfall season, and it's going to start at this point and it's going to end at another point. And you could almost count on the fact that you're going to have a certain amount of rain during the rainfall season, or it will take a particular shape. For the Caribbean, we would have an early rainfall season and then a late rainfall season. But we're seeing way more variability now in the climate system. And so one of the things about the variability is we see the character of how rain falls changing. In the Caribbean, we can relate to that. We see dry spells, and then when it rains, it certainly just rains. But we're also seeing drought and the emergence of more and more frequent droughts, and droughts that are not just localized within a country, but region-wide droughts. And it's the same kind of pattern that they are seeing. The emergence of extremes. For us, it's hurricanes, we call them hurricanes, and parts of Africa again also. And then, of course, for us, sea level rise is also a critical problem because we are small islands. But we see similarities in the manifestations of climate change. Where we also see similarities is because we often are dependent on similar kinds of sectors. Certainly, for economic development, agriculture is critical in both regions. And we are seeing the impact of climate change on agriculture. You may want to think about the impact of climate change on health, but once climate change begins to impact water, you can almost begin to see tropical diseases, and so you see that kind of thing. And then you can think through the various sectors where the climate change is going to have an impact. and there are strong similarities. There may be differences in size of the economies, but certainly the impacts are similar.
Would you like to elaborate a little on because I noticed you made a distinction between manifestations and then the specific ways in which these impact the regions. Could you elaborate a little more on agriculture? Because I think that is what most persons are concerned about.
Right. Well, you know, as I say, we are climate scientists, so we deal with the manifestation side, but of course we do interface with the agricultural scientists and talk about the impacts. And you can begin to think of the range of impacts on agriculture. For one, in the Caribbean, a lot of our agriculture is rain-fed agriculture. And I think for large parts of the African, especially the small agricultural holdings, well, if climate change is impacting the rainfall, and you can begin to see that, you can extend that now into productivity. One of the key things about climate change, you know, and maybe we'll come back to it, what I'm really trying to say is in our current states, our countries are way too climate sensitive. And one of those sensitive areas is agriculture. So when you get the flood, the agriculture is impacted. But then when you get the drought, agriculture is impacted. And so because of that climate sensitivity, it means that once the climate begins to change in any kind of way, it's impacted. So the productivity then cannot be consistent. It's unreliable. And if you are depending on agriculture to make sure your economy has a good year, you can't, because there's an unreliability that's built in. But then there are other impacts, you know, things like heat, and heat bring about pests, you know, and then you think about livelihoods, you know, the people who are depending on agriculture, especially when this is their main livelihoods. And you can begin to extend it further and further and further. The critical thing there is the climate sensitivity, you know.
Yeah. Well, we're seeing the effects, I think, of the extreme rainfalls that we're having now. The supermarket shelves
Right.
are empty for the most part, and where we find the products, they are very costly. And I would think this is due in part to or a lot to Beryl, you know, which passed through the other day, and the heavy rains that we're having now. I don't know if you.
Right. So again, what you're really hitting at is that, boy, we don't tend to think about it a lot, but we are so extremely climate sensitive that any kind of variation in climate, and let me tell you why we are so.
I was just going to say,
All
why
right.
are we so climate
All right,
sensitive?
a couple of reasons. Let's take the Caribbean.
Yes.
The first reason we're so climate sensitive is because we're small islands.
Yes.
And certainly as small islands, there's a limitation on where you can live.
Yes.
So you're either going to live on a coast, and which are narrow coastlines. And if you just look on our islands, all our major cities, all our hospitals, our airports, our coastline, you know. And so, you know, our major transportation network, our electricity network. And so you talk about Beryl, and when Beryl skirted the coastline of Jamaica, it took out transportation, it took out telecommunications. So we're just small, you know, and it limits where we can put infrastructure. Even if you're not on a coastline, you're on a steep hillside. And then that brings it, because a lot of our islands have these really rugged interiors, hilly interiors. So we get that sensitivity because we really have little choice about where to live. Where we live is climate sensitive.
Yes.
We also get the sensitivity because of what we use to determine our economic development. So you started talking about agriculture. Agriculture in our current situation is dependent on things like favorable weather, dependent on regularity. We must get the rainfall season as we have always been getting the rainfall season. But that's not the case, you know. But it's not only agriculture. Think about tourism. Tourism is a really climate sensitive industry, both in terms of we need to have good climate to attract, but also the elements. It's very water dependent, it's very natural resource dependent. You must have the green and the beautiful oceans and that kind of thing. So you begin to see that things we depend on for economic activity. Then there are what I would call the quality of life indicators. Water is one of them. Our water supply, if we don't have rain, we don't have. And we know this in the Caribbean region. Just let a couple months go by without rain, we are in trouble. But it's also health. This is the chickpea and the dengue. Dengue is the issue right now. But then in the heat, it's the asthma. So you end up with all of these factors. And then the last thing I would say is that, in truth, we're an outdoor people. And so we build our lives around what we expect the pattern to be. Just think about it. We really send kids to school so that they are out during the summer when it is hottest. We don't have to deal with them. But then, I use that, but we, you know, we we clean our drainage around the cycle. We plant around the cycles. We live outdoor lives that depend on us being able to move from building to building, and our tourism is based on outdoor activities. You put all that together, we have a kind of intrinsic, inbuilt climate sensitivity to all of life. And
How is this similar for the African continent?
I think a lot of what I have just described, save for the size.
Because I was going to point to the huge landmass that they are.
Right, but they have all the other elements, what they do for economic development, how they pattern their life to take advantage of ambient conditions, you know. Those kinds of things exist in the same way, So both sets of people have this extreme, what I call sensitivity to climate. So if we pattern things around that, then the minute the pattern begins to go awry, which is what climate change is doing it, you now begin to get the discussion about resilience, because we now have to figure out how, in the face of this new era, do we still continue living life as we have been used to all along.
That brings me to the question about sustainable practices. What kind of sustainable practices can small Caribbean states and African states alike put in practice too?
Well, one of the things about climate change, and this is kind of where we want to move the conversation to. You started off asking me about agriculture, and if you ask the average person out there, climate change is an agricultural problem. So we can start out by thinking about the sustainable practices within agriculture, whether that is, clearly water harvesting so that you always have water, or you want to do micro ponds so that, you ensure you catch the water when you have it, or you want to do greenhouse farming, which is, you're almost controlling the conditions within it, or you want to do shared agricultural plots where everybody has a little thing and you deal with one set of infrastructure, or you want to do climate resistant crops, varieties of crops. Those are all kinds of, or you do your terraced agriculture so that the hillside won't come down, or your crop rotation. All of those are things that are sustainable practice. Some we used to practice, and we have to come back to those things. But I want to be very clear that the kind of sustainable practices don't only belong to the agricultural sector. We now need to talk about things like energy. Energy is a critical thing. One of the things climate change is doing to you and me is it's driving up our energy bill. Just look on your monthly, you're spending a lot more for cooling. You multiply that for a small business, you go across, and our countries are dealing with such energy demand now in the face of climate change. Well, what are those sustainable practices that we need to do? Is that renewable energy? Is that certainly dealing with the energy efficiency, building energy efficiencies into the things we do? You can take it again and go to waste. Waste, is a source of emissions, but it's also how much energy you use. And so where I'm going, there's a whole once you begin to see climate change as not just agriculture, but energy, but also waste, but also water, but also health, you begin to see that there's a whole raft of sustainable practices that need to be developed across sectors in order, and you could even go down, climate change affects me and you, and sometimes we don't even realize it. We live on fixed incomes, most of us at least, you know. But in your monthly income, you are now paying more for electricity, paying more because for the products in the supermarket because they're not there and they cost more to import to replace what is not being produced because of the drought. Paying more for the health bill because you have to make more trips to the doctor with the asthmatic condition in the heat. you know you you're paying more for water that have to drinks that have to buy for you and the kids and all of those kind of things. So that portion of your income that is your disposable income is less. So it's less recreation, it's less doing other things. So there's no even a force of a sustainable practice on how do I control. So there's a financial aspect is where I am going, and it hits me and you, but you can scale this up now to community, to governments now that have to deal with it.
So that brings me to the question of policy. And we could look at policy on two levels.
Right.
Policies for protecting the natural resources. What kind of policies would you?
All right, so again, if you're following my argument that climate change spans the range of things, one of the things we always have to remember about climate change is that climate change targets the most vulnerable. And so it makes the poor poorer. It takes where there is a gap and a disparity and it enlarges this. And so what we really have to do is begin to look sector by sector where those vulnerabilities lie. So in truth, the policies that we really have to do don't even have to be called climate change policies, but they have to be policies that protect the most vulnerable. Let's take the education sector, for example. The child who is not going to go to school is the child likely who is already coming from impoverished circumstances, who now has to either spend much of the day trying to deal with the lack of water or no food and that kind of thing. We need a policy to ensure that they are protected, so that when climate change exacerbates that situation, there is equal access to education for all. And I'm just using education as an example. Healthcare. Climate change takes the person for whom healthcare is already a challenge, throws on the fact that you need more healthcare. What is the policy that we now need to ensure healthcare protection for all? Let me throw one more in. Climate change affects the outdoor worker.
Definitely.
That's your security guards, that's your tourism worker. We need the occupational safety and health policies to deal with that. So we need climate policies to deal with how much we're mitigating, how much greenhouse gases we're putting out. We need climate policies to ensure, for example, that we always have enough finance, insurance, financing, so that in the face of a disaster, you have layers of resilience built in. But we're really going in. We need the policies to ensure education is accessible by all. Health is accessible by all. Outdoor workers are protected. You may not think of those as climate policies, but they are very much. We need building policies.
Yes. So I've initially said we could think of policies on two levels, but you have sort of pulled them together. I was thinking of policies to protect the environment, the natural
And
resources,
we need those.
but also policies to achieve climate justice
And resilience.
and resilience.
Yes,
So
yes,
you
yes.
have pulled them
Right,
two
right. So we
together.
definitely need those to protect the natural resources.
Yes.
That those are under threat. But climate is really, the way I like to put it, why do we say climate change is a developmental issue, a developmental problem? Because that's really what it is.
Yes, yeah.
On the one hand, yes, what it is doing is every time we're poised for growth, we get a disaster that, have to spend a percentage for rebuilding.
Cycle.
So it's constantly disrupting our development trajectories. You know, if you see the list of things we have responded to in the region in the last 20 years, add burial to that. Every time you think, if it's not a hurricane, it's a drought, it's a flood. So it's developing that and not allowing us to develop,
Yes.
But the other part is that it's denying the development benefits to those who should really be benefiting from a development track. Because it's taking those vulnerabilities and really working on them and magnifying them. And so you need the policies, yes, to protect the environment. But you need the policies to protect those who are being directly impacted and who are being denied the kind of just basic living that they should be getting as a benefit of development.
Yes. And what I'm gathering from you is the sad part about it is that it's so cyclical. So, it's the same area in Jamaica, for instance. It's the same African countries that are having these terrible droughts and so on. Yes.
So if these are part of our reality, the question is, no, boy, what must we do? We know it now. We know that we're in a new climate era. Unfortunately, in the near, mine and your future, we're not going backwards.
Yes.
We have committed ourselves to a harsher climatic environment. We know what it is doing to our countries, to our development cycle, our development trajectories, to our people. The question is now we need to be very deliberate about action.
How hopeful are you that some, remedial measures will be successful in the Caribbean and in Africa? Oh.
I for as much as I deal with what sometimes they say I'm the I talk doom and gloom. The science does tell me that we are in for a harsher environment. I actually am quite hopeful, and I tell you why I'm hopeful. We have a history of resilience.
Yes.
And that history of resilience is linked to our ability to voice and be an advocate for, coming from, our historical roots.
Yes.
And I see that in the region. I see that with climate change, we are continuing that kind of advocacy for justice. We link the climate with the justice. And a very good example is the 1.5 to stay alive. The small islands, the least developed countries, including some of our African colleagues, came together and really put 1.5 degrees, 1.5 to stay alive on the table. Now, for for the people who are listening, they'll say, what is 1.5? The truth is we have been warming from, say about the 1900s, the post, before the 1900s was the pre-industrial time. We've been warming. And the Caribbean, the least developed countries, the Alliance of Small Islands came together and said, listen, we cannot warm more than 1.5 degrees more than where we were in 1900 by the end of the century. By 2100, no, the Paris Agreement had come about, and the Paris Agreement is, I'm going to say this is really a kind of a 2 degree agreement saying, okay, the world is giving in that we will warm by 2 degrees. But Caribbean said, no, absolutely not. It has to be 1.5 and put 1.5 as a threshold for survivability, for a viable future. Um, the fact that the 1.5 got written into the Paris Agreement, the fact that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produced a special report on 1.5, the fact that 1.5 still remains on the table, is really a testament to the voice, that resilience voice. And so that gives me hope. No, I won't tell you that we have passed 1.1 degree warming. So 1.1 of the 1.5 is gone already. But that gives me hope, because we have that. Beyond that, the other thing that gives me hope is what I would call the resources that we have in the Caribbean, the intellectual capacity, the innovation that we begin to see emerging, the sustainable, innovations. That gives me hope. You're beginning to see a Caribbean kind of contextual response. What do we need to survive, in agriculture, in water, and so the application of the intellectual resources, especially towards innovation, is giving me hope.
And investments?
I'm beginning to see that, but that's not keeping pace. Since some of those investments have to come from out. But you begin to see that. So climate finance is becoming a thing. The fact that we have loss and damage on the table now, and that we have a loss and damage fund, again, is another testament to the fact that the Caribbean and the least developed countries said, no, we can't continue like that. So we always had an adaptation fund, and we had a mitigation kind of fund. Now we have a loss and damage that says, when I get that category 5 or super, people think maybe we're gone beyond category 5, super hurricane, and it creates this damage. We need a fund to deal with that, because, that's, so the investments are coming too slow, but we're not sitting down and waiting, and that's what gives me the kind of hope. And then I was going to say the kind of greater just engagement. People are now talking climate change and demanding more.
There certainly is more awareness.
Awareness, right.
Well, I have to say that you have so much passionate intensity for this topic and the area, and obviously you have done a lot of work in the field, and we could sit all day and talk about it, and I could learn so much more. So we may have to come back and have a part 2 to this conversation. But I want to shift a little to ask you about how you see your legacy in this field.
Wow.
I know Professor Chen. I worked with him on the Confucius Institute. And I know that he did a significant amount of work, and you're now, as it were, carrying on his legacy, building your own legacy. But how do you envision this in the future? What do you think your legacy will be?
One of the things that, it's not just mine. I would, also, so Professor Chen began it, we are carrying it out in the climate studies group, Mona, myself, Prof. Stevenson, across the UA campus, Dr. Charlery, Prof. Agar, these kind of things. We have always wanted to make it clear that we have the capacity to do climate science within the region and answer our own questions. So when climate change was emerging as even an issue, one of the challenges our negotiators would have, for example, is they don't have information relevant for the Caribbean. So you were negotiating with information that was developed by somebody else. and that didn't was not fit for purpose. It was neither your context, your scale.
Yes.
And I think what Professor Chen began and what we have managed to continue and build out is the capacity to do climate science within the region.
Right.
You know, and I think we must do everything to protect that. It's not just the climate studies group, Mona. For example, we coordinate what is now called the Caribbean Modelers Consortium,
Okay.
which every 2 years the climate modelers, those who do the projections from all the UA campuses, from Cuba, from Suriname, from Belize, come together and we say, what do we need to do now in science to ensure that our negotiators that can speak the latest science, that the information that we need is available.
Yes.
And I think those are the kinds of things, the capacity to do good, world-class science that is relevant
Yes.
is the legacy. And, you know, we have trained so many young people now, you know, I can sail off into the sunset.
Okay. So that's a good note on which to end, because my next question was going to be, what advice would you give to students who are aspiring to do work, research in your field?
Boy, I would say the climate change field is really open now.
Yes.
You know, and I hope I've conveyed that, you know, it's not just warmer temperatures, but
Yes.
it is really, it's the social sciences, it's the humanities, it's the arts, it's the finance sector, it's the pure science. Keep an open mind.
Yes. Yes.
You know, and pursue that thought that you have in your mind, that you
Yes,
think,
yes.
you know, make use of the opportunities, but keep that open mind and certainly do the exploration and do good work.
Yes. I want to thank you for sharing so generously on your research, your work, what you have learned, ideas that you have for helping the Caribbean as a region to develop climate equilibrium. I want to also thank you for highlighting this sort of multidimensional nature of the work, because very often we think of the manifestations, we think of the effects, but we don't think of the kind of interrelatedness to other disciplines. That it's not just you people in the sciences, but that others of us working in the humanities, in the social sciences, can work on other areas that are relevant. And most importantly, I'm happy to hear of your determination to produce work in the field that is relevant to the Caribbean region, and also highlights work that highlights the connections, the relatedness to Africa and what is happening to people in Africa. Thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you for
I know
having me.
you're extremely busy, but you have been so generous and so kind in being willing to come and share with us. Thank you very much.